All right, hi everyone. Welcome. So for this next talk, we have Victoria Baranov. So the title of the talk is Development Microeconomics, the Role of Poor Mental Health in Perpetuating the Poverty Cycle in Rural Pakistan. And a quick intro for Victoria Baranov is an Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Melbourne. And in her research, Victoria couples RCTs and longitudinal data in her research that looks into how psychological factors can perpetuate poverty traps. There will be a Q&A at the end of this talk, so you can either submit your questions on Swapcard and I'll manage those and forward them in the Q&A, or ask the questions during the session. So over to you, Victoria.
Great. Thank you so much, Bridget, for the introduction. I'd first like to take this moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, especially anyone here today. And I would like to note that the lands were never ceded. So as Bridget mentioned, I'm going to be talking about a very long, complicated title, but I'd rather just say, like, we're going to be talking about mental health and development. So I'll definitely mention some of my work that has delivered mental health care to women in rural Pakistan as part of a broader sort of agenda in development economics that has focused recently on mental health. And so the question about why mental health is important is sort of a first thing that I'll want to talk to you about. One, mental health, it's been in the news not now, so maybe less of a sort of thing that I need to discuss and sell to you as a younger generation of people, post-COVID especially. We care about people's health and well-being. Mental health is a direct measure of their health and well-being, and so trying to improve their well-being is sort of one of our immediate goals. I think beyond that, there is actually an additional question of whether mental health actually is also productive. I.e., you could think of like really, really extremely poor mental health where you think, okay, well, yeah, that might influence people's productivity and ability to be in the labor force, to work, to, be productive in their lives. But there's also sort of like less extreme gradients or less psychological distress at levels that are not sort of at the very, very, very extreme, where people sort of are functioning suboptimally. And that might be happening, might be the case that mental health is important for all of these other economic decisions. And we want to understand that because that influences our calculation of how much we should be spending on, in terms of aid, how much should we be spending in terms of improving mental health. It's currently very under-resourced, so basically, you could see from the slide here, development assistance for mental health has never exceeded 1% of the total development assistance for health. So it's a tiny, minuscule amount of what we give to developing countries in terms of aid, and yet 80% of the global mentally ill health, people with mental ill health live in low and middle income countries. So these are places that not only don't get any financial aid or development aid for it, but it is also places where there are basically no psychiatrists or psychologists. There are no forms of basically acknowledgement of psychological distress or poor mental health as a condition that needs to be even treated. So that means that 80% of the world's mentally ill health, people with mental ill health are not getting treatment. And these people are in developing countries where they're trying to sort of build their lives in situations that are extremely complicated and stressful. Whether or not this, sort of perpetuates their poverty is the main question. So this is the fundamental question that economists are currently trying to study. And so this is sort of a complicated figure, but it basically links this idea that there could be this possibility for a psychological poverty trap. So what we know from, what we know is, poverty is associated with a lot of economic uncertainty, a lot of adverse shocks. So things that basically make people quite stressed just all the time. And that stress is a risk factor, a major risk factor, the major risk factor for mental health conditions like depression and anxiety. And so this link between poverty and psychology is pretty well established, and I'll show you a little bit more on this causal evidence from randomized control studies. But then the question is whether psychological conditions or poor mental health, even without being necessarily clinical depression, just sort of suboptimal mental health, whether that impacts economic decision making in a systematic way. So let me give you an example of what I mean. Depression makes people pessimistic about the future, and if people maybe are pessimistic about the future, maybe they don't think, oh, okay, maybe I should invest in my education, because what's the point? Maybe I shouldn't invest in anything in the long term, because what's the point? It's all gonna go, down a handbasket. So what is the point of spending effort? There are a number of other sort of ways of describing psychological conditions that systematically tell us that people with these conditions might underinvest effort, especially in the long run, but even in the present, they might not work as hard or might not be as productive. There could be other sort of psychological processes happening. If you've heard of scarcity from Eldar Shafir and Sendhil Mullainathan, there's sort of cognitive bandwidth tax. So maybe having psychological conditions creates sort of a tax on your psychological bandwidth, so this rumination that's happening in the background always, that makes it just difficult to do day-to-day activities. So that includes work as well as other things. But all of that goes in the direction of basically, lowering investment, lowering work effort, lowering educational attainment of the children with people who have mental health disorders because they don't support they're not able to support their children and invest in them. And so that then reinforces, of course, the poverty. Right? So if you don't think that you should invest in the future and that working doesn't matter and why bother, then why would you would continue to stay in poverty. You would not be able to sort of fight your way out of it. And so this is the psychological poverty trap that reinforces the cycle of poverty, right? So basically this psychology mechanism and poor mental health may potentially reinforce poverty because as people get poorer, they have worse mental health outcomes. And so that's another sort of finding that we have found in many different settings. So I'll show you this results from this causal arrow, basically that reducing poverty through cash transfers typically improves mental health. We have lots of studies on that because we have lots of studies on cash transfers, as you probably are well aware of, as effective altruists. What we have much less evidence on, but we're really, really interested in understanding, is how mental health more broadly, and perhaps different psychological conditions and at different stages of mental distress, how all of that impact economic decision making in systematic ways. And so this is the causal arrow where we still have limited, but very much, this is limited evidence, but this is very much where the new studies are sort of coming up. So let me talk you through some of these. So first, how do we, I'll talk about, first, to do this, I guess actually I might be going a little bit out of order here, but to do this, we can't just look at the data and say, do people with depression make poor decisions, or do they, ultimately have less, worse earnings? Because people with depression also have, well, first it's a cycle, so they might be depressed because they're poor, and so you're sort of, if you look at that correlation, you're going to infer potentially the wrong direction of the causal and effect. But there are many other potential confounds that could be attributing, why someone is depressed and the reason why their earnings are not as high as they could potentially be. And so in order to study this, we really need causal evidence, strong causal evidence, that typically comes from randomized controlled trials. So this is something that medicine typically uses, but now is much more common in general and applied economics, but in particular in development economics, we are really fans of understanding how things impact other things through the randomization as our design. And so in randomized controlled trials, right, we randomize who, well, ideally we would say we would be able to randomize who's depressed and who's not. We can't randomly cause people to be depressed, right? That's a bit unethical. So what we do is we typically take depressed people and we randomly assign them to treatment or sort of wait list or not treatment. So there's a lot of ethical questions about that. Part of the reason that we can do this in this way, by randomizing whether someone gets treatment or not. The reason we are able to do this is because in developing countries, or in middle income countries, basically there's no treatment for depression or mental health care. So that's the care that they would normally get. They would just get nothing. And if we're running a study, we have a limited budget, so we can't treat everyone anyway. So the fairest way to allocate treatment then is going to be through random assignment. So upon sort of figuring out that who is depressed, conditional on being depressed, the best way to sort of the most fair way to allocate treatment is going to be through randomization. So that's really how we go about it. And then with randomization, we are ensured that when we compare outcomes for people who received treatment for depression to people who, didn't receive depression, compare the outcomes to the depression treatment, the people, when we compare it to them, we know that the difference is due to reductions in depression through treatment rather than through other confounds like their circumstances at home, whether they're experiencing IPV or various other sort of confounding factors that are often correlated with depression that might be also through their own channels impacting their economic decision making and outcomes. Okay, so how do we improve mental health? I'll go through actually a various several different ways. So I've obviously talked about psychological interventions by treating depression. It being one of them. There's psychotherapeutic, which means just sort of talking types of therapy. There's pharmacology, which you guys are probably familiar with, SSRIs, etc. There's other sort of lighter touch interventions through like the positive psychology and gratitude approach. But of course, there's also other ways that we think that we could just be improving people's mental health. And I just told you that people who are who experience poverty are more likely to experience stress and poor mental health. So what if we just treat the poverty and give people cash? So I'm going to focus on these two here. What happens when we give people cash, and also then what happens when we treat the psychological disorders. And the question then is going to be, so first, that when I show you all the evidence on what happens when we just give people cash, it's basically showing you evidence on this channel here, right? What happens when you reduce poverty? Obviously, we can't randomize people into poverty. We can just randomize them out of it, and for the same ethical reasons that we just discussed. But I'll show you that, like, when we provide people with cash transfers, what happens to their mental health? It tells you that there is an effect on their psychological well-being, and we also know what happens to their other economic decision making. But what it doesn't, when we give them cash, it doesn't still tell us about this causal arrow, because obviously when we reduce their poverty by giving them cash, it affects their economic decision making in many different broad ways, right? We've alleviated their financial constraints, so that's going to affect how they might, decide to invest, whether they should put money in their children's education, how much to work, and so forth. So here, I'll first show you that we can influence mental health through giving people cash, but then otherwise we can also how we can influence mental health more directly through these psychotherapeutic and pharmacological types of interventions. So let's talk about cash. So as I mentioned, there is there's several types of RCTs, and actually there's one that isn't listed here. There's another one in Nature Human Behavior that was even more recently published. that went through a set of 25 different RCTs of cash transfers. A lot of them are, give directly, for example, and so they have basically found that if you give people cash, you improve their mental health by something like, 0.1 to 0.2 standard deviations, improvements in mental health across various different conditions. There are other ways that we identify these effects, some of which is through income shocks. So there's another recent paper in economics that has looked at income shocks due to basically rain in Indonesia, and has found that there are, basically there's cash transfers that the Indonesian government provides as well, and so they interact basically they look at both of these cases. So districts, so this is suicide rates, districts that don't have drought, the effect of the cash transfers still reduce the risk of suicide. So cash transfers reduce the risk of suicide, but they do so more in districts that are experiencing drought. So it's like a double effect, right? Experiencing drought means that individuals in those places, they're going to have lower earnings. But when they receive cash transfers, they're going to be much more protected from these negative effects of droughts. So it's like it's both the fact that, we see it through cash transfers, these effect of poverty on psychology and mental health and suicides, but also that we see the same patterns. For example, when we look at income shocks through sort of more quasi-random sources like nature through drought. So in terms of, so we know, as I mentioned, we know through a lot of RCTs that cash transfers reduce poverty and improve mental health. So that's one way to benchmark our effects of, we'll talk also about, which is the way, if we want to just improve mental health, which is the way to do it. So then we also have these psychological treatments. So we can use psychological treatments such as cognitive behavioral therapy, and which you may be familiar with. This is a type of talk therapy. Here is a review of 27 RCTs that was conducted in low and middle income countries. So you'd think that this hadn't been done, but in fact they have, by a number of global mental health experts. So this has been a recent sort of uptick in global mental health, basically since the 2010s or so. There's been a lot of evidence that has been published in Lancet and similar types of articles showing that you can improve people's mental health by just giving them psychotherapeutic interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy. Typically, these are developed, delivered through community health workers. So these are not people who are trained in psychology or psychiatry. They're just trained in a protocol to deliver that specific therapy, that cognitive behavioral therapy, and I'll talk about that. And so in this case, what we see is that when we do these types of psychological interventions with people who are experiencing depression and so on, we see improvements in mental health by about 0.5 standard deviation. So that's more than double the effect size than what, say, like giving cash would do. But these interventions are really conducted by, on much smaller scales than the cash transfers one, and they're targeted towards people who are already experiencing depression. But they are highly effective, so we can do that. So why this is important is that we can then use these types of interventions. So the psychologists just care about the psychology, right? They just say, okay, what's the improvement on mental health? But as sort of economists, we care, but we were ultimately interested in that the psychological poverty trap story. So what we want to know is whether treating mental health affects economic decision making. Or does it just make them happier? Which is cool too. Making people happier is good. It's important. But we also want to know whether there's other benefits, because we need to figure out how much to invest, right? We need to figure out how much money and resources do we need to invest to this. So if there are returns to investing in mental health, development aid into mental health, because it also makes people, work and invest in their children and all of these other sort of downstream effects. That means that the dollar invested in mental health care is much more influential, has much better development return than if it just made people happier. Okay, so we can use cash, we can use pharmacology, but we basically want to use these psychological interventions to learn that causal chain. And so this is what economists have recently been doing. So I'll talk about this study, which I've been a part of, where it specifically happens in rural Pakistan. It's called the Thinking Healthy program, and it is a type of cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's a type of talk therapy that was delivered by community health workers. So they were trained to deliver it. They had no other psychological training. It's just one of these 27 that was mentioned here in the study as a meta-analysis. But here what we're going to do as economists is that we're going to follow these people, basically over 7 years and see whether or not, so okay, this I should mention also that this is for maternal depression, so women who were depressed in pregnancy. So we follow them over the course of 7 years, and we look at all of the economic decision-making that these women were engaged in. Primarily, that's parenting and parental investment, because in rural Pakistan, these women are not in the formal labor force. So all of their sort of work goes towards raising children. So that's a lot of what we'll focus on. So just a little bit more on the Thinking Healthy program. It's one of the largest psychotherapies. So this was published, so the impacts of the mental health, the mental health impacts of this intervention was published in the Lancet, and then it was adopted by the WHO as a model for care for improving maternal mental health in low resource settings. And this was one of the largest psychotherapy trials in the world at that time, which meant that if we want to look at all of these downstream effects on economic decision making, this is the best study that we could possibly use to do it. And so when we follow them 7 years later, this is basically the results of the study. So if we look at first mother's mental health, we look at depression severity. So just focus on the black bars for now. I've split the sample by whether the mother had a boy or a girl, and it turns out that there is some important gender considerations as well, but I won't focus on that today. Just here, you can see that the depression severity was reduced. So this is 7 years after the intervention was concluded. We still see that mother's mental health was much better. They had 0.2 standard deviation reduction in depression severity at that point in time. So 7 years later, this is a one-off intervention that happens shortly, basically like in the last trimester of pregnancy, in the first 6 months after postpartum. They're have no other care otherwise, right? They get no other, so after the intervention concludes, there's no other psychological care. 7 years later, we still see that this intervention was protective and at improving their mental health. So that's remarkable. And then second, we look at all of the mother's decision making. We look at whether or not she controls resources in the household, whether she is financially empowered. We look at a number of different monetary parental investments. So like sending kids to private school, buying books for kids, etc. So all of the types of monetary investments that involve money. We also look at time-intensive investments and a few other outcomes. And what you can see here is we see substantial improvements in both the empowerment of the women, so they could control more of the resources in the household, and they spend them more on investments in children. So the women spend more time with the children, but they also command more of the resources in the household and direct them more to the children. One of the notable things is that the mothers who had girls, who in this setting would actually typically be more disadvantaged because having a girl is not good for the mother, basically. She's blamed for that. And these are the women who are actually empowered more and for whom we see greater benefits. I'll note that in terms of child development outcomes, we do measure those, and we have limited impacts that we find on child development. So it is possibly just a matter of we're underpowered, It is also possible that the most important thing, which is socio-emotional development at age 7, is where we would likely see these effects manifest the most, are self-reported by the mother, which, because they are self-reporting the socio-emotional development of the child, they are likely to be more sensitive to that, having gone through psychotherapy themselves, rather than not. So basically, the treatment itself might have influenced the way the mothers report about the child's socio-emotional development. So these measures, I would say, are basically not the best that we could do, given the best that we could do at the time, but now that we have done this, we are paying much more attention on how to objectively measure child development in subsequent studies, because it is really hard at this age and in the field setting to measure child development. Since that paper was published, there have been now more studies and more, one study that's not published yet, but looking more broadly at how treating mental health conditions improves labor market and other economic outcomes in low and middle income countries. So this is a meta-analysis looking across 20 some odd studies as well. Most of them, I think all of them actually are randomized control trials as well. And here, where they look at across a various number of work-related outcomes. No, I obviously wasn't giving you results on labor force participation for women in rural Pakistan, because that didn't make sense. They weren't engaged in the labor force one way or the other. But in these other studies, sometimes we do have, employment, time in work, the ability to work, days in work, functioning at work, so a number of work-related outcomes. And what they find across a number of studies is that treating psychological conditions and limits does improve work-related outcomes. Basically, people on the magnitude of about 6.15 standard deviation improvements in work-related outcomes. So the takeaway is that, basically, if we go back to this slide with the causal arrow here, is this there? Yes, we see a causal link between basically treating mental health conditions and economic decision-making, particularly in the direction that would make this sort of a vicious cycle. And then the next set of questions comes to, okay, well, what do we do about that? What is cost-effective, what is sustainable, what is scalable? So there's a number of interventions that, for example, the World Health Organization has, the Thinking Healthy, also Problem Management Plus, Strong Minds in Sub-Saharan Africa. But then there's also that just, why don't we, if we know that, giving people cash is going to improve their mental health, then why don't we just give them cash? Do we need to also treat their mental health, or just giving them cash sort of solve all the problems by itself? And so for that, we need to know a little bit about how things scale. So for example, what we've done here is, in this study, the Thinking Healthy program has been adapted to be peer delivered, to be more scalable. Because all of the studies basically that I talked about, the ones that were in the 27 studies in the peer, in the meta-analysis that was evaluated to just do mental health interventions in low and middle income countries, work at improving mental health, those were all quite intensive, right? We had to train community health workers to deliver the intervention. These community health workers' time is extremely scarce. It's not necessarily true that they're, expensive to train. It's just that there aren't that many of them. And to scale up how many health workers there are, that is the expensive part. That is where the governments are just, they're struggling to meet that demand, or, the demand for mental health, or even healthcare. And so this intervention was delivered to be sort of a task-shifted model, where they're shifting some of the tasks to lower sort of trained individuals. So in this case, these are volunteer peers, women in rural Pakistan, who were identified by the community health workers as being, sort of good candidates. They trained them to deliver the cognitive behavioral therapy, sometimes in groups, sometimes in individual sessions. And so then they monitor the peers to make sure that they're doing a good job, so that they are themselves not suffering from mental health or overburdened with the work, and so on. So the benefits are, of course, that it's much cheaper to run. It is much more scalable because it doesn't require that many resources and human capital resources from the highly trained parts of the healthcare system. But basically what we find, so when we look basically 6 months out to 36 months out, we see that there's an improvement in mental health. So this is the effect sizes and standard deviations, about 0.2 standard deviation improvement. But this is only by 36, this is already at 6 to 36 months. What I haven't showed you is that the original Thinking Healthy program, the effect sizes were 3 times to 4 times higher, especially in this early period. So here what we're identifying is effect sizes that are equivalent to what we found 7 years later in the other one, where of course those effect sizes would have decreased substantially. So what we're seeing is smaller effects, which is perhaps not, you get what you pay for a little bit in this case, which is that, it's not surprising. We're not getting as many effects. And what we see in terms of parental investment, we're missing the title here. So this is the effects on parental investment. We're seeing improvements, but not as substantial and not as persistent as we observed in the earlier trial. So this is sort of consistent with the fact that scaling up is going to be the major challenge in improving mental health in low and middle income countries. And of course, training people to deliver psychotherapy and so on is very hard. Maybe we could just give them cash, and maybe that'll just be better, because cash is easy to deliver. We have, organizations that give directly that can do it very efficiently to people. There is actually one study that did a direct comparison of another psychological intervention called Problem Management Plus. It's also a WHO sort of mental health intervention that's been sort of promoted by the WHO as being very, very effective. It's not specifically for maternal depression. It's more general intervention. And this study is a really nice study where basically they either give a group just cash transfers via Give Directly. They give them either Problem Management Plus or the combination of cash and Problem Management Plus. And then they have a control group a pure control group that doesn't receive anything. So we can see whether or not the combination of giving cash and giving them psychotherapy is going to be much more effective also at giving them anything, outcomes. So if we just look, the short answer is no. In their case, they find no effect of the psychological intervention when they scaled it up. And so I should note that they did this on a scale of, basically the sample size was something like 5,000 or 6,000 people. In all of the other studies, those psychological interventions, the scale was less than 1,000, basically. So this is, the scale was already, 3 to 4 times more people who are being treated with psychotherapy. So this is already a test of scale. And what they found was basically the psychological intervention. So if you look at the green is PM plus, if they were in that group, whether that improved their mental health. So these bars are the effect sizes. And if they're you basically can't, if you can't see them, that means they're not statistically different from 0. So here, if we just look at whether PM plus, the psychotherapy alone improved their mental health, it did not. What did improve their mental health was giving them cash, the red, or so it reduced their depression and their stress, and it improved their happiness and life satisfaction. And then giving them cash and PM plus typically had quite similar effects. This is on mental health. Across a number of other economic outcomes, there's similar patterns. Basically, there's no effect, almost no effect at all of receiving psychotherapy. The only place where there is improvements is on, and this is important, on IPV. And so there's reductions in IPV. I believe that's the direction that we're going here. And so that's something that's been a bit of a sort of shock to us in that we are struggling with the scale. But I'll sort of end by talking about, and so that's the thing that we're working on, is figuring out how to scale mental health care. Because right now, basically, it does seem really promising. It's something that we should be integrating. Perhaps we shouldn't be integrating it universally in the sense that we shouldn't be giving psychotherapy to every single person, because it is expensive. But how we deliver it and to whom might be important. But I think the good thing is that we know that cash transfers have been effective in this domain, and that it might be one of the reasons why when we provide cash transfers, we also see changes in investment behavior and other economic sort of outcomes and decision making. Apart from just obviously like them having more resources, they're also feeling a bit less stressed and a bit more capable of making decisions. So it's towards understanding a bit the mechanisms. Now, with regards to COVID, the COVID pandemic has actually changed a lot because it's forced us to go digital. And it's forced us to have a reckoning with mental health, like on a level that we definitely didn't before. There was discussion about it. There was obviously like a global mental health, group of people that were working on this, that were pushing this agenda. But like, you cannot stop talking about mental health, like during COVID. That was like every other headline, right? Everyone is depressed. And so as a result, this has become a part of the national conversation everywhere, including developing countries. And there's now a lot of appetite for developing new methods through telecounseling, through digital counseling, and so on. And so the authors of this study have talked about how during COVID, a lot of low and middle income countries were re-imaging this, or sort of reimagining how they're going to respond to mental health considerations, whereas before they just didn't. They didn't acknowledge mental health issues. COVID has made them start acknowledging this more. And in fact, a number of countries, it's a bit slow. A number of countries during the COVID pandemic enacted, including in low and middle income countries, it had a bunch of different protocols where they, India, for example, had a toll-free mental health helpline number that they implemented. They established sort of various teams. They, gave more money and more training to psychiatrists, counselors, and so forth, whereas before there was really not much. And so the fact is that we're in a position now in low and middle income countries where, we've shifted towards more, trying to experiment with more digital provision to try to improve scale, issues of how do we scale this up in a more effective way. But also we have a lot of appetite and a lot of momentum from the governments who have already established these new sort of protocols and so on to try to improve mental health in their countries, where, like I said before, it was essentially ignored prior to COVID. So we're at this point where we can make big strides to try to improve mental health in low and middle income countries, and hopefully that will sort of reinforce, if these things are effective, they'll reinforce other types of development aid and make them more effective as well. Okay, so that's the end of my talk. So if you have any other questions, obviously, and comments, you can email me, but we're going to have a Q&A now. And if you'd like to ask a question, I think there was the app, but also you can ask via the microphone, which is probably better.
Yeah, thank you so much. We do have some submitted questions, so I think I'll begin with some of those, and then if people are brewing their questions or want to chuck me the swap card, because then at least it's orderly, that way we can get them in order. So one of them from Luke is the ideal mental health treatments that we would provide in Australia similar to what we would be providing internationally to these people, or are there kind of substantial differences?
That's a great question. So first say that in Australia, mental health care is not amazing. It's actually probably worse than in other high-income countries. So I don't know if I would compare it necessarily to Australia, but I think the question is how would we do it differently? And I think it is good to be different in that it is much more streamlined in high-income countries because you have just a better sense, a better resourced care around the healthcare, where you can, when someone comes in with a mental health condition, that you can sort of simultaneously start them with pharmacology and some sort of cognitive behavioral therapy or other type of psychotherapy for the best sort of chance of recovery. The combination of the two is the most effective. In low and middle income countries, you may not want to be so quickly throwing around pharmacological things because we don't have as much monitoring for and resources and monitoring for negative side effects, which is very important. And so the sort of more counseling type of approaches have a little bit less of a downside risk when you don't have as much monitoring. And so it's not as intensive, basically, when you are dealing with low resource settings, basically. So you have to be the approach has to be very much a public health approach where, what happens when you have to do this at a really big scale and you can't necessarily tailor it to the individual because you don't have the training or the monitoring to ensure that it is good. So that's really an important sort of consideration. Everything in low and middle income countries that we have to recommend have to be sort of appropriate for this sort of environment, and whereas in developed and high-income countries you have the resources to really tailor it and monitor the individual very quickly. So different, definitely different.
Yeah, fantastic. That makes sense. So another question here. Early in the causal diagram, you mentioned there are different confounds for when we're trying to understand causally what's impacting economic choices. Are there any sort of ideal study designs or experiments that we should be able to run that would really illuminate something that's important to you that hasn't been done or has got a lot of issues with how you would run it?
Yes, that's a great question. So so randomized controlled trials are great. A lot of them are very expensive to run, and a lot of the ones that we're using as economists to study how this treating depression and so on impacts decision making leverages the fact that there are a team of psychologists and psychiatrists who develop these interventions and then run them in low and middle income contexts. So they do it in a way where there's a lot of kind of stuff going on and things take a long time, and they're also in the field in low and middle income countries, so we can't necessarily do a lot of the lab experiments that we actually want to do. What we ideally could do is have someone who's depressed and then treat them for depression in high-income countries, and then have really good monitoring of decision-making, have them in the lab, do decision-making, have administrative data on them over a period of time. But the problem is that in high-income countries, you can't randomize depression treatment, basically. It's not unethical because everyone really has access to care, right? So you can't withhold care from the control group. So there's that's the tricky thing. You can't really study. So there's a lot of, basically the control over how we look at decision making is not as fine in the settings where we're looking at them in developing countries, whereas we wish that we had better, we wish we could do it in developing countries because we have all of those fMRI machines which we could put people in to see how we could go down to a neuroscience level basically, which and build up from there to sort of link up together the neuroscience to the decision making, to really learn about what all is going on rather than just having some treatment and then some outcomes on decision making so many years down the line where we don't really have a full picture of what the mechanisms are. So that would be sort of ideal from I think a researcher perspective, from a knowledge generation perspective. That's what we'd be caring a lot about. And then I think we just still are limited in how much funding is available to titrate the different types of interventions and their delivery mechanisms and to whom we deliver it. I think that's still, but that's doable. That's something that is actually, we're getting more funding and a lot more countries are interested in running mental health programs and programming. And so that is something where just money and attention is actually changing, so that we are going to be able to figure out who to target and with what. That is something that's going to improve.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that leads in nicely to this next question, which is, what are some of the barriers that need to be overcome in order to get that funding or attention or kind of belief in this sort of program to take it to the
COVID. COVID did it, right? In some ways. I think, no, so I definitely, there were barriers. I think the big barrier in low and middle income countries is more stigma and how to overcome the stigma aspect of it that is still relatively understudied. But in terms of actually, attention and funding and resources, we are definitely seeing a monumental shift post-COVID towards the focus on this. So I'm hoping that we're going to learn a lot more over the next coming years because there's all this, there are just many, many studies now that are working on this already. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
An interesting question here. If the study fails to scale, if something that being an intervention that works in a small group fails to scale, do you believe that the previous study is wrong? And how do you kind of reason about these like sizes and effect sizes?
Oh yeah, that's really hard. That is, I don't know. The answer is I'm not sure actually, because I haven't really seen a great example of like, okay, we did this thing and we scaled it up and we really thought through very hard on where it might fail during the scale up. And I think this is where we need to do better design of scale up interventions, where we try to, maybe try to do the same thing in the same place at the same scale with the same amount of intensity and resources, and then scale it up, right? Like so that it's in the same experimenters do it on a small scale and then expand rather than everything at once, so they can first replicate that study. Usually the case is if we're scaling up, problem management plus, if we're scaling that up, it's because there have already been a number of studies and basically meta-analyses that have shown that it has been at least a smaller scale been impactful and been effective. But then I think with the this paper here where I talked about, which scaled up problem management plus, I think they're still trying to figure out why it failed. And I don't know that they designed it to necessarily measure the sort of the scale up, the fidelity, and so on. There's a lot of so there are a lot of questions about how do we learn about what fails during scale up. In practice, it's many different things at the same time. But I think this is where we need more research and figuring out how to scale things. And there is a lab at Yale that Mushfiq Mubarak runs that is specifically interested in scale. I understand that he's also interested in working in scaling up in Bangladesh, which currently is also wanting to do sort of a national mental health program. So that there is some research in this space for sure.
So
but it is
more soon.
It might be more soon, but less. That one's still I think a little bit more elusive. Yeah, the scale question.
Fascinating and important. So one of the questions here is how much did, I'm going to ask two questions at once here actually. So how much did the psychological treatment plus the cash cost in comparison to just the cash? And then a sort of a question about resourcing in general is if someone's delivering CBT, is that affecting their ability to get other health resources?
Yes, so that's a really good question. Both questions that are good. I do not remember how much the psychological component, in addition to the cash, cost in the problem management plus. I don't remember that. I know that in the peer-delivered version, the costs are hard to say because with the community health workers delivering the intervention, the actual physical cost of getting them to do it is not that high. It's just that you cannot scale that up. Basically, it's not really an immediate cost type thing. For the problem management, I think it's a substantial increase in cost over and over. The logistical, sort of the trainings and actual the people time costs, even though they're in developing countries and they are not necessarily specialists or anything, you still have to pay them wages. That said, which is why the peer-delivered versions of these are popular, because then at least you have peer-delivered and you can pay. The peers often do it for volunteer, or very low cost, basically, in that case. And so studies have found it to be cost effective. By comparison to cash, probably not close. Like, I think cash is still more effective.
Would it be like double as expensive, triple, 10 times, 100 times? What do you have a guess?
Per like unit of mental health improvement. For like the peer version, it's probably double, I would imagine, just in general of organizing that. More if you're trying to pay people to do it more systematically rather than through peer volunteers. Yeah. And the second question was...
the second question was about resource diversion between community health workers.
Yeah, so that's the big problem. It absolutely diverts resources. And so that is why we have to scale it up, we can't just use the existing infrastructure of community health workers. We'd have to train many more additional health workers. That becomes really expensive. And there's already like a scarcity of them to start with, even though there's a lot of demand for them. And so it's not clear how to do that.
And do any of these studies sort of think like, oh, this person's spending their time getting mental health care? Does that mean they're not getting other kinds of health care and actually having overall outcomes that are worse? Is that like possible to capture in what's been in some
I
of
don't
these
think
RCTs?
that's something that we have looked at really, is whether the time spent in this is diverting from other healthcare. It certainly is a time diversion. It is time. I guess if anyone's done counseling, you know that going to therapy, you could be doing other things. It is a weekly thing. Usually, you have to spend an hour, whatever. So yeah, definitely. I don't know that it is something that we've looked at. It is certainly possible that it could be diverting like health-seeking behavior, but we haven't seen any evidence of that, at least so far.
And you can imagine health being holistic in a way where someone's feeling better, they are able to access other kinds of healthcare as well. And there's sort of multiple ways that could go, I suppose.
Yeah.
So some more questions we have here. What effects do cultural beliefs have on mental health outcomes, and how does this sort of interact with economic decision making here?
That's a great question as well. There are cultural beliefs. Usually the cultural beliefs that we worry about are stigma. And so stigma is a major issue. So when we do these types of interventions, typically we try to destigmatize to the extent possible, where we might say that, you're suffering from depression, but it doesn't mean like that, we try to demedicalize it a little bit and make it less of an intensive medical diagnosis and more of a, we do need to tell them, but we make it less of a stigma thing. And then when we offer them the treatment or the counseling, we don't again demedicalize it a bit. And so what we've seen is that providing people with therapy typically makes them sort of have less stigma, I think. They're a little bit more open and become more open to other therapy. Now the question is whether people, at the onset, whether people who believe the therapy would be more effective are the ones who report greater gains. Actually, I don't remember. We have that data, and I know we've looked at it in several studies, and now I don't remember which way it went. My suspicion is that people who thought it would be more effective would likely have seen greater effects. But because it doesn't stand out, it might not be as I expect at this stage. So it's more complicated than, we don't know as much yet. And then with regards to how it might also interact with the decision making and the economics of it, that's a whole nother level. But yeah, the stigma aspect of it is still something that we I think need to learn much more about. What we do know is that people are very reluctant to seek care. This is true across the board, but especially in developing country settings. And so if you just tell them there's a national hotline, that might not go very well because they might not bother to contact that. And we see that, like I said, in low and middle income countries, but also in Australia, especially among the male population, for example. So that's still something that we're battling everywhere.
Awesome. I'm going to ask you one more question, and I think it's time for us to wrap up. So I guess just if you would summarise what the most important takeaways would be for attendees who would want to be able to reason about, you know, even a headline about this kind of intervention or a charity or something like that, what would be the kind of key things that someone should keep in mind?
I think the takeaway here is that I think we're learning that mental health is important, but I think actually the key takeaway is also that the mental health interventions, the way that they impact economic decision making and like the sort of strength of them, we know it's there. It is not, the magnitude is not nearly as large as perhaps some people might think it is. So it is not going to be, it's important and it's been forgotten about, right? There's no development assistance to it basically, but it is not going to be the silver bullet is, I think so far my takeaway from it. It's more complicated. There's going to be issues with scale up, but I think we're going to get through that through various digital sort of platforms and all those kinds of sort of technological advances are going to help us deliver much more mental health care, but it is not, it's not going to solve all of the world's problems, unfortunately. But it's great that we're sort of getting to at least the point of acknowledgement. So yeah, not a silver bullet, but it is important, and we're starting from an extremely low baseline. So I think those are somewhat complicated altogether. But yeah.
Thank you so much. This has been incredibly informative, very nuanced. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone.